Hello everyone and welcome to Dad Chats episode 2. This is the show where me and my father, the former Chief of Defence Staff, Field Marshal the Lord Houghton, sit down and discuss world events, specifically in this episode, Glastonbury, Gaza and the power of music. It's a really great episode. I hope you enjoy it. I certainly did. I found it very enlightening. I hope you watch it, enjoy it and enjoy it in the comments section discussion afterwards. I'm going to stop talking now. I hope you enjoy it. Episode 2, Dad Chats. My biggest feedback with these chats is I've got to stop looking at you like I'm in awe.
Yeah, because you're going to see someone's got hold of your bollocks and they're about to squeeze them and you go,
Well, it's been a week since we did our first Dad Chat.
An unforgettable week, Thomas.
And a lot's happened, mainly Glastonbury. Did you watch Glastonbury?
I have to say I didn't see very much of it. I saw the odd snippet on the news. I didn't take it. I understand Rod Stewart at 80 was a great success, as was Lulu, his supporting act.
And Simply Red.
Not so about Simply Red.
Yeah, he came on and he attempted to high five Rod Stewart and Rod Stewart blanked him.
Oh.
Yeah. Not on purpose.
Not on purpose.
He was just singing whatever he was singing.
I think Rod was probably swept up with the emotion of the occasion.
It was a very emotional occasion, Glastonbury.
I'm barely 70 and he did that at 80. And I think I listened to his interview the following day and he was very modest about it and said that he'd had his most nervous night the night before, couldn't get to sleep.
Oh, right, well. Yeah. Did you watch Kneecap and Bob Villain?
I have to say I watched or listened to neither of them other than, dare I say, I took in some of the BBC coverage.
Yeah, the media coverage of Bob Villain and Kneecap has been quite prolific.
I mean, whether or not it was well intentioned, it's definitely been prolific, and I do sometimes worry that the media can act as a sort of an amplifier for things that, although unfortunate, are then allowed a stage and a publicity that is significantly greater than what they're worth and their original intent.
There's a big debate going about what constitutes hate speech rather than free speech. Initially, what are your thoughts on the difference?
Well, I think I'm not a judge on these sorts of things, and there will be, as it were, legal precedence that establishes the various boundaries between hate crime, free speech, hate speech, call it what you will. And I think perhaps you could probably differentiate from, at least from what I observed, and definitely not firsthand, perhaps between the two. To me, the Bob Villain one was more obviously something that was inciting hatred. Whereas perhaps, although again I'm dealing with slivers of exposure to what Kneecap's music was all about, whereas theirs perhaps has a more justifiable, that might be the right word, but for dare I say a band, and I'm not remotely certain what the classification of their music would be, sort of hip hop. Rap, West Belfast bass, three young lads, a Irish Republican context, a desire to promote the unity of all Ireland, to promote the Irish dialect and languages. I think that perhaps there's, and look, I'm not in their defence here, it is a more, as it were, forgivable profile of what they do and stand for. Because I think they're appealing to some of the heartstrings of Irish history, which, perhaps to a justifiable extent, parts of the Irish nation got a raw deal historically. I think perhaps what we saw, is it Bob Villain? I'm not quite certain whether that's one of them or both of them, was a little bit more undignified and on point. And I think there's probably more to account for in respect of their performance.
I think the issue was he was calling death to the IDF, and whether or not IDF count as a people he's inciting to. Yes, it's a military operation, so the actual likelihood that tens of thousands of white middle class recruiters who are at a festival are they going to suddenly put their strongbows down and go off to fight? I mean, that's not going to happen, is it? So
no, it's a bit far-fetched, but again, I suppose it's quite simply that the Israeli Defence Force, the IDF, is seen as, the executors of political instruction. And I don't know, you can undoubtedly say that the degree of injury, humanitarian disaster, the nature of what is now being perpetrated within Gaza far exceeds human tolerances for what is internationally acceptable behaviour. Now then, I historically am a huge admirer of the Israeli Defence Forces in respect of their professionalism. I think that in the early stages post October the 7th, what they were desperately attempting to do was act within the constraints of international humanitarian law against an enemy, Hamas, who, not uniquely in warfare, but specifically in what we're talking about, had absolutely no care at all for the protection of the lives of Palestinian people. In fact, in many respects, the more that were killed, the better they felt their cause was supported. And what an appalling state of affairs that is, and how difficult it is for a disciplined armed force to have to perpetrate things which are very, very close to the tolerances of what we know as international humanitarian law and the dictates of armed conflict more generally.
You're saying that's post October the 7th. Now, after October the 7th, it's undeniable that they have gone too far.
I think that the length of time that's ensued, the scale of the damage done, I think that now in the court of international opinion, and I'm saying that as opposed to some legal judgment, and I can certainly say this as a parliamentarian, it is felt now that the Israeli Defence Forces and the Israeli government, because the Defence Forces are acting in accord with their direction, have probably exceeded what is generally accepted to be tolerable.
Probably,
yeah. I will always.
You can't say definitely.
No, I don't think you can say definitely, because
Why?
Each example
that would infuriate people, though, because people would go, "What do you mean?" It is like there's too much evidence now.
Yeah, but it's then where we say, well, instantaneously look at Russian war crimes in Ukraine. At what point did they cross the boundary of the indiscriminate use of force and what should be the preservation to the maximum extent possible of civilian and non-combatant lives? I'm afraid that the passions of war, some of this gets not thrown out the window, but just, judiciously ignored.
That's a tough one.
It is, and on the one hand, I mean, there's no doubt about it, and I think most sensible people in the United Kingdom, I can't speak for them, I'm not an elected politician, would say that the two greatest innocent parties in all this are the moderate societies of, both the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Jewish people. They
People don't seem to treat Israel as if it's got separate individual people who think different things. They just go Israel, and there's some really scary comments. I've seen comments like, there's comments like, "Oh, I think we owe that Austrian painter an apology." All this sort of stuff. You see that creeping up, and it's like, oh, and that's why, You do worry with that sort of death to the IDF. Okay, he's talking about the military there. Stand fast. It's a conscripted military, so you are actually talking about everyone has to join it. But there are also people there who won't make that distinction between that not being anti-Semitic and actually just going, yeah, Jewish people.
Mm.
That's what's so scary.
Yeah. And no, I don't think there is a nation more sensitive to the excess use of force, more sensitive to, because of the background and the context of the Holocaust, because they feel that they are the potential target of a country, Iran, whose avowed intent is to extinguish the Jewish state. They are hugely sensitive to all this, but they find themselves pretty short of alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they are short of alternatives at the moment, partly because they're the current government of Israel have adopted a course of action which is to see this through to the end in terms of the extinguishing of Hamas as a potential lethal force.
Because it's, from their point of view, if you don't exterminate Hamas, they will just keep going.
Yeah. And the counter-arguments to that is that it'll just keep recreating itself.
Exactly.
I mean, it's very difficult to know where this is going. It's very difficult to know when it will get back. It will not be resolved through violence, albeit politically endorsed violence on either side. There are some hopes that the fundamentals of the Abraham Accords, which you may or may not recall, were those accords in which a number of Sunni states in the Middle East signed up to, that fundamentally they recognised that in many respects the disruptive force of the Middle East was not the State of Israel, but was Iran. Iran, through its variety of proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, other armed groupings, were the ones that were the genuine disruptors.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore the common enemy of the Middle East, including the State of Israel, was in fact Iran. Now, it could well be, and one doesn't yet know quite the extent to which America will continue to play a supportive hand in this, that the extinguishing of Iran as a military threat and its proxies might bring about the circumstances, not necessarily of regime change, though would not that be arguably a good thing to bring about, but at least will rally the supporters of the Abraham Accords towards bringing about a negotiated and more peaceful settlement within Israel itself. Now then, this is going to involve a lot of bridges have been broken, a lot of people killed, a lot of things destroyed. It's going to take an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of money and rather a lot of time. But ultimately, this will only be resolved through peaceful means and a coming together of a common sense of destiny.
Mm.
But it goes back to points I've made in other of these exchanges, that the misrepresentation of the morality of great religion, which brings religions against itself and even has factions within religion, one thinks of Sunni, Shia, Protestant, Catholic and all that, go back to your kneecappers and all that. These remain deeply emotive things which take an awful lot of time to grow out, put into context, survive, live on. Reflected back in the vast majority of my Irish friends, of whom I have many, having spent quite a lot of time in that province, in many respects their sense of Irishness far dominates their sense of either being a Protestant or a Catholic. And they are frankly a bit fed up of religions that tend to accentuate what divide people rather than what unite them.
Mm-hmm.
Now then, when will that sort of, let's move on from this? Because at the moment, what we've got both between the Shia and the Sunni community, and Israel are in the middle of it, are people in power and things that are now being prosecuted which are divisive rather than cohesive. But there's a few storms yet to be weathered, I fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people tend to look at Muslims and Arabs as one big hive mind that all think the same thing. And it isn't true at all.
No, because there is a religious distinction within the Muslim faith, but there's also an ethnic distinction or cultural distinction between Persians and Arabs, who are very different. Iran and the majority of the Sunni states.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that musicians getting on stage and making big political statements has an effect?
Yeah, I sort of think it does. And it's actually an interesting question coming from someone who calls himself a comedian, because comedy also has its role. I mean, comedy is a sort of an antidote to misery and anxiety, and it pricks the consciousness of people who get wrapped up in all sorts of ridiculous agendas like extreme wokeism. In its own way, music, and probably, I think comedy is a particularly remarkable British tradition, which, dare I say, we share in the British Armed Forces. But I think that music, going quite way back in time, but even in my own lifetime, I grew up through the American music that rebelled against the war in Vietnam, music which was all about the human rights of black Americans, the great themes of the times they are a-changing, that we're trying to wake America up to move on in its set of values. We play back to, the Beatles dabbled at it with John Lennon and Imagine. One of the great proponents of the teleological certainty of human harmony. I think music does play a highly influential part in shaping opinion, and it particularly does it within, can I call it, youthful people, because that's, in many respects, youth is the most vulnerable to influences. And I think the influences that people have in their school days, their adolescence, their early university time, maybe their first job. But I think that cleverer people than me have said that by the time you're about 25, by and large, the parameters of your life view are set by the time you're about 25. And think of the impact that music has had, education, family has had on you by then. And therefore I think music is hugely impactful. And I think that when it's placed, and I wouldn't yet put necessarily Kneecap or Bob Vylan in a historical context, when it sits in a historical context, it might be more appreciated. Well, okay, it might have been contrary to some of the rules of the day, but one can understand why people, vocalists, musicians, who act as an expression of what a lot of people were thinking but did not have a stage in which to express it, were not perhaps quite as wrong as the law of that time said. Now, I'm sort of doing a lot of hedging of bets here, but many things are more justifiable through the retrospective lens of history than they ever appeared to be at the time, particularly when at the time the somewhat unfortunate magnification of media anxiety plays into it.
So you think, in general, you've got to let the musicians play
No. Necessarily. I don't think they should run riot, but I think that there are certain outlets to social anxiety which I think that we've got to be quite considered about. Music is one. I do think comedy is another. I think that people who, I was about to say sellotape, but I mean
glue themselves to pavements. Are you about to do
glue
Just Stop
themselves
Oil?
to pavements
Are you about to do Just Stop
and
Oil?
disrupt the lawful lives of well-meaning citizens, should get their just desserts.
Yeah, that's what. If Just Stop Oil could just turn the paint buckets upside down and start tapping a beat, get a band together,
because
we'd listen to you more.
Yeah, because humour, words, music, they play on your mental faculties
And the soul.
and the soul and the heart. Disruptive anarchy brought about by people who are willfully wrecking people's lives, to me, is not helpful.
It's interesting. I think in a debate, if you can make the audience laugh during a debate, you're probably going to win. You know this from public speaking. Winning people over, if you make them laugh.
Hey, I'm not going to be a judge of that. I don't think laughter alone is sufficient. I think it's got to be accompanied by a certain amount of wisdom and reflection and all the rest of it. Music is...
I'm not saying just rocking out to the House of Lords with a pair of fake breasts and a horn.
No, but what I do think is that it's important that we have a number of different ways, dare I say, of sort of expressing our anxiety and our concerns. And I do think that such things as music and comedy are every bit as an expression of what people are thinking in the moment as elections and politics. After all, when it comes to elections, you probably only got one go every 5 years. Whereas with musical trends and comedic trends and all that, that is more in the moment and arguably more relevant. And and perhaps the most sort of powerful tool at the moment, for good or for bad, is social media, because I sometimes think that the politics I bear witness to in the Houses of Parliament are almost unaware of the scale of the sentiment of alienated youth, of people who feel disenfranchised.
It's huge.
The thought that our politics is so divorced from the lives of ordinary people on occasions that the amount of frustration out there is arguably unquantifiable, but is significantly greater than many who live in relatively pleasant bubbles remotely understand.
There you go, everyone. That is episode 2 of Dad Chats. Hope you enjoyed. I certainly did. Please do carry on the discussion in the comments section. Also, leave your questions so that we can tackle them in future episodes. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.